Welcome to Shujin Academy VGM Club. I'm Professor Tom, your faculty sponsor.
It is the night, and there is time for Klax.
Today's opening theme is Intro and Attract Screen from the Amiga version of Klax, composed by the exceedingly prolific Furniss. Not only did Furniss compose music for the Amiga version of this game, he also composed for the Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum, MSX, and Amstrad CPC versions of Klax. And if that sounds like a lot of platforms, it's because Klax is one of the most promiscuous games of its time. After its initial arcade release in 1990, it received official ports to 20 other platforms. It was actually one of the very last official releases for the Atari 2600. If you haven't played it, since it is no longer the 90s and there is thusly no longer time for Klax, it is a puzzle game where colored tiles fall down a ramp and you catch them and arrange them in a well where they disappear once you've matched 3 of the same color. For today's episode, I decided to take a bunch of songs from puzzle games and make a playlist. Some of these games are well known, some of them are more obscure. Several of them appear on a bunch of different platforms, because puzzle games tend to be fairly simple graphically, and there was a desire to find the next Tetris once that game caught fire. And speaking of Tetris, I'm not going to be playing any version of Korobeniki, the Russian folk song better known to Western audiences as the Tetris song. Rest assured though, there will be Tetris. To start off the show, we're doing 2 full music blocks of games that are not Tetris. Our first block starts off with Round Select, Next Round from the arcade game Blockout, a game that starts with the concept of Tetris, but pulls it into a 3-dimensional space and then expands from there. It's not quite clear who composed this soundtrack, but the game was developed by the Polish team of Aleksander Ustaszewski and Miroslaw Zloblacki, and they might have written its music. If you're curious about this game, it's actually been ported to modern web browsers, and you can play it at blockout.nu. I'll put a link in the show notes. Speaking of non-Tetris games, Planet Puzzle League is part of Nintendo's Puzzle League series, which started out with a game released in North America under the name Tetris Attack before the Tetris company complained to Nintendo and they rebranded future releases in the franchise. I'll be playing B3 Cubed, which is a great part of composer Masanobu Matsunaga's absolute banger techno soundtrack. I've featured this game before, and fellow VGM podcast CRT Sound System did a deep dive into it that gets a link in the show notes. Our third song is Colloseum from Q-On-Pa, a puzzle game for the Super Famicom composed by Ken Kojima. If that name sounds a little familiar to you, it's because Kojima worked for TNE Soft, where he composed the music for this game and also worked on several of their golf titles. Although Q-On-Pa was not released for the Super Nintendo in North America, it's actually a port of a Western-developed Windows game that had the title of Endorphin, and that game has a very interesting soundtrack that doesn't map well into the format of this show, but it is worth checking out. For the third song in a row, there's a link in the show notes. I've mentioned before that I like the Picross games, and I'm happy to revisit them with Wario BGM1 from Mario's Super Picross, which is the second entry in the series. This game only saw a release in Japan, although you can play it in North America via Nintendo Switch Online selection of Super NES games, assuming you're okay with playing it in untranslated Japanese. Mario's Super Picross was composed by Toshiyuki Ueno, who has a limited number of game credits and who also shares a name with a notable director of Japanese sexploitation films. Song 5 in the block is Background 2 from Bust-A-Move 2 Arcade Edition for the PlayStation, not the arcade, sometimes known as Puzzle Bobble 2. I bought this game along with my PlayStation console, and it was an excellent purchase. My hooligan friends and I wasted much of our misspent youth playing competitive Bust-A-Move against one another in between bouts of Street Fighter, Tekken, or Mortal Kombat. This adorable Bubble Bobble spin-off is not only remembered for being fun, it's also infamous for its bizarre cover art, which features people trapped in purple bubbles with their eyes wedged open. Composer information for this was a little tricky to track down, but I believe it was composed by Norihiro Furukawa of Taito's house band Zuntata. The block's sixth song takes us to the Nintendo Entertainment System with In Game from The Adventures of Lolo, composed by Hideki Kanazashi and implemented for the NES hardware by Hiroaki Suga. This is a game where you try to collect hearts by moving boxes around a stage to keep various enemies from attacking you, and it's part of a greater series called Eggerland that has quite the history, starting out on the MSX. The entire chronology of the Adventures of Lolo series is quite the rabbit hole, so I'm not going to unpack it here, but I will say that the music is fun, and that series hero Lolo and damsel in distress Lala were later imported into the Kirby games as antagonists. To close out the block, we'll hear Farmer's Market from HuniePop, a game I chose to represent the match 3 gems on a grid type of game, invented with Bejeweled, and most commonly seen now in free-to-play mobile game trash like Candy Crush Saga. I also chose this game because it's an adult title, and there are a number of puzzle games that feature sexy women as rewards for success, although when this game came out in 2015, there were much easier ways to see scantily clad anime girls. I also chose this game because I really like composer Jonathan Wandag's soundtrack. Farmer's Market is a song that plays during the game's puzzle-solving date segments, specifically during the dates you take at the Farmer's Market. Now, it's time for your brain to enjoy all these tricky songs. Those songs were Round Select, Next Round from Blockout, B3 Cubed from Planet Puzzle League, Colloseum from Q-On-Pa for the Super Famicom, Wario BGM1 from Mario's Super Picross, Background 2 from Bust-A-Move 2 Arcade Edition for the PlayStation, In-Game from The Adventures of Lolo for the NES, and finally, Farmer's Market from HuniePop. When I sat down to compile the playlist for this episode, I knew I had to play a song from a Puyo Puyo game. It's not the biggest puzzle franchise stateside, but in Japan, it's a huge deal, and after poring through a dozen candidates, I decided to play a song from Puyo Puyo. Specifically, it's Puyo Puyo for the FM Towns, which is a system that I have never featured before. The song is named Sticker of Puyo Puyo, and it was composed by Haruo Tajima and Masami Yitsuse. The show opened up with Klax, which began life in the arcade and then got ported to lots of other systems, and there are several puzzle games in the 16-bit era that had a similar life experience, where they were released on a ton of platforms. One of those games is Zoop, which was released for the Genesis, Game Boy, Game Gear, Macintosh, MS-DOS, PlayStation, Saturn, Super NES, and even the Atari Jaguar. It's an oddball little color-matching game, and it has a fun soundtrack. For our second song in the block, we'll hear Uptown Meeting from the Genesis version of Zoop, composed by Mark Davis and Bob Scumaci. It looks like Davis did the original composition, and Scumaci implemented it for the Genesis, but I feel like Scumaci should get a composer credit because of the way he updated the song for the Genesis sound chip. For our third song, we're moving from a relatively forgotten game to a title that is well remembered and beloved. It even has a character in Super Smash Bros. I'm talking about Dr. Mario, Nintendo's pill-matching, virus-busting classic starring a plumber who went to med school. Dr. Mario's soundtrack has two very good background songs, one called Fever and another named Chill, and I'm going to play Chill because I'm laid back that way. This will be the original NES version of the song, not one of the rearrangements for a later port of Dr. Mario, and like so many other Nintendo classics, this song was composed by Hirokazu Hip Tanaka. When Sega released the Game Gear in 1990, they wanted a puzzle game to compete with the version of Tetris that Nintendo included with the Game Boy. And they found it in Columns, a dual-matching game that was originally developed for Hewlett-Packard's HP UX operating system before Sega purchased it from the original developer and ported it to all of their contemporary platforms. As with Puyo Puyo, I wanted to make sure and represent Columns on this episode, and so our fourth song in the block will be Clotho from the Genesis version of Columns, composed by Sega great Tokuhiko Uwabo. Speaking of games that got ported to every platform on Earth, Lemmings was originally released on the Amiga and then found its way to more than 20 other systems where players got to enjoy trying to rescue a bunch of little mindless green-haired creatures as they walked unceasingly into predicaments. Because this game was so promiscuous, I had a lot of different versions of the soundtrack to choose from, so I kinda just chose the Genesis one at random. I have to say that the Genesis version of this soundtrack is a mixed bag, but there are a couple of diamonds in that rough, and we'll be hearing one of them. It'll be Stage Theme 4, also known as One Way or Another, originally composed for the Amiga by Tim Wright and Brian Johnston before being adapted to the Genesis by Hirohiko Takayama. Let's puzzle our way through some songs, shall we? Those songs were Sticker of Puyo Puyo from the FM Towns version of Puyo Puyo, Uptown Meeting from the Genesis version of Zoop, Chill from the NES version of Dr. Mario, Clotho from the Genesis version of Columns, and Stage 4, also known as One Way or Another, from the Genesis version of Lemmings. Let's take a break and figure out a word from our sponsor. Thanks to the incredible financial success of this podcast, I've got more money than sense, and I spend it on cool video game stuff like the PlayStation 5 Pro and a high-end gaming PC with a ludicrously expensive NVIDIA GeForce card. But I'm so busy making this great show that I don't have time to play with all of my cool gaming stuff. That's why I rent them all out on AirCNC. AirCNC is the nifty new app that lets you get paid while other people rent video game systems from you. If you've pre-ordered a Nintendo Switch 2 and you need to pay for it, just put it on AirCNC and let somebody else pay you to play it for a while. Get paid for the games you're not playing with AirCNC. Now, back to the show. Today's final music block is all about the 800-pound gorilla of puzzle game franchises, Tetris. Russian developer Alexei Pachitnov knew he was onto something when he found himself getting so distracted playing the game that he was having trouble making time to finish writing it, and once it was ported from the terminal-based Electronica 60 to IBM-compatible PCs in the mid-80s, it escaped the Soviet Union and soon spread throughout the world. It's appeared in some form or another on virtually every major gaming platform since the late 80s, and even most of the minor platforms. We're going to take a tour through 6 songs from various versions of Tetris. Although this is absolutely not a definitive list or even a good overview, these are all just songs I like from assorted Tetris titles. Trying to do a deep dive into Tetris music could take up several episodes. It would be an interesting topic, though. Maybe someday I'll do it, although the research would be quite the undertaking. To start things off, we'll hear 06 from Tetris Kiwa Mimichi, a Japanese exclusive game originally released in the arcades for Sega's Naomi hardware that was later ported to the PS2. Tetris is a staple in Japanese arcades, and I'll talk a little more about that in just a second, but I wanted to be sure and feature this game because it's got a really fun soundtrack. I found it via fellow VGM podcast Bar Silence, where host Jameson featured it in his deep dive into Tetris tracks. I'll link that episode in the show notes. We do not know who composed this soundtrack, but they did a really great job. Tsunekazu Ishihara is not a household name, although you are probably familiar with some of the things he's managed in his career. He's currently president and CEO of the Pokémon Company. But before his career achieved those illustrious heights, he was a humble game producer and also a passionate Tetris fan. He actually wrote a book called The Solution to Scoring 100,000 Points in Tetris. This led him to try to improve upon Tetris, and the fruit of that endeavor was Tetris 2 plus Bombliss for the Famicom, a game which was ported to the Super Famicom under the unsurprising title Super Tetris 2 plus Bombliss. For our second song in the block, it only makes sense to hear from this Super Famicom Tetris sequel. We'll hear Tetris B-Type. This game was composed by Mitsuhiko Takano alongside the mysterious K4 and the also mysterious Dal-chan. I did not have a Game Boy growing up, so the version of Tetris I played the most during my delinquent youth was Nintendo's version of Tetris for the NES. VGM legend Hirokazu Hip Tanaka was tapped by his corporate overlords to make music for this game, along with the Game Boy version. I would be remiss if I didn't play something from my own experiences with Tetris on this episode, so we'll go with the NES version's Music 3, which is an original composition instead of being something based on Russian folk music. Apparently, this song was also used as hold music when you called Nintendo's headquarters, which is an interesting little factoid. In North America, Atari Games released an arcade version of Tetris which was fairly well received. However, Japan got a different arcade version of Tetris from Sega, and Sega's arcade Tetris became the foundation for a whole tradition of arcade variants of Tetris that introduced a host of innovations to the game. Composer Yasuhiro Kawakami created an original song for Sega's arcade release of Tetris called Tetrimix. This cabinet came in two different versions, one using the YM2203 sound chip and another using the YM2610B. I think the YM2610B version sounds better, so that's the one we'll be hearing. While I was going through various Tetris soundtracks to compile this playlist, some songs from Super Tetris 3 for the Super Famicom caught my ear. Super Tetris 3 was a follow-up to Super Tetris 2, and it included not only Bomb Bliss, but also a new color-matching variant called Magicalis, and the first 4-player mode ever in a Tetris game. It even got a specially branded variant version of the multitap adapter for the Super Famicom. The song we'll be hearing from this game is Magicalis Select, and it's from composer Shigemitsu Goto, who also worked on games in the Fire Pro Wrestling and Yakuza franchises. To close out the block, we'll hear from one of the most unusual Tetris soundtracks ever made. When Philips Interactive Media set out to make a version of Tetris for the CDI console, they leaned into the flow state you can achieve while playing the game, and utilized the CDI's full-motion video capabilities to have looped video of nature scenes playing behind the familiar well that holds all the Tetrominos. Composer Jim Andron turned in a set of new age tunes for the game, and then it was generally forgotten until a group of vaporwave enthusiasts discovered it and brought it into prominence. We'll hear Foster's Freeze, which is the Level 5 theme, and if you like this, you'll like the whole CDI Tetris soundtrack, which you can find on Jim Andron's YouTube and SoundCloud pages. And now, the songs drop like blocks. Those songs were 06 from Tetris Kiwamimichi, Tetris B-Type from Super Tetris 2 plus Bombliss, Music 3 from the Nintendo version of Tetris for the NES, Tetrimix from Sega's arcade version of Tetris, Magicalist Select from Super Tetris 3, and finally, Foster's Freeze Level 5 from Tetris for the CDI. That's the show. If you want to reach me, I'm most active on Blue Sky as shujinacademy.bsky.social. You can also find me on Threads, Tumblr, or Instagram as Shujin Academy VGM Club. All episodes of the show are posted to my YouTube channel, which you can find by searching for Shujin Academy VGM Club. You can email me at shujinacademyvgmclub@gmail.com. Links to everything are available on my Linktree at linktr.ee/Shujin Academy. Please leave me a 5-star rating on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you're finding this episode. New episodes are released once or twice a month, depending on how often I get them done, and they premiere on Thursday mornings on your favorite podcatcher and on 8beats.co, the internet's #1 game music radio station. My show is also featured on TerraPlayer, the cool app that's a destination for gaming podcasts and other content, so you can check me out there. Finally, if you just can't get enough of me, I'm also voicing esports reporter Samson Escapades on audio drama How Much in Bison Dollars, which you can hear on Spotify and FGC Radio. If you're listening on Spotify, please be aware that they've pulled a few of my episodes before. There is a non-zero chance that they'll eventually pull my entire podcast, as they've done with a few other game music podcasts, so I'd strongly suggest you subscribe elsewhere to be sure you can get all the Professor Tom goodness you crave. Special thanks for this episode goes out to fellow VGM podcaster Jameson of Bar Silence Podcast for contributing cover art. You can and should find Bar Silence wherever you download podcasts, and check out his website at barsilence.com. I've got one more song to play us out. For my money, Tetris Effect is one of the best video game art experiences ever created. It combines the refined gameplay of 30 years of Tetris with fantastical visual effects to make a synesthesia masterwork. The game's soundtrack is from Hideki, and we're going to finish the show with a track called 1989 Part 2. This song comes from a level that's a tribute to the Game Boy version of Tetris, and it takes a musical cue from the NES Tetris reworking of Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy from the Nutcracker. So, this is a song composed by Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky, implemented in a very different style by Hideki, inspired by a chiptune version from Hirokazu Hip Tanaka, and crediting VGM compositions gets complicated sometimes. Thank you for listening. I'm Professor Tom, and I'll see you next time on Shujin Academy VGM Club. Tetris game, Tetris game. Gonna play a lot of Tetris game, Tetris game. Feel no shame when we play a lot of Tetris game, Tetris.